Okay, and we have Professor Susan Fiske. I already mentioned some of her seminal work on dehumanization, and Dr. Fiske is going to talk about how ordinary people become violent, frustration, and dehumanization. Okay.
Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I'm honored to be part of this symposium on this really critical topic. What I will be talking about is clues to the way that ordinary people might become violent. Of the subtitle, I'll be focusing more on dehumanization, but toward the end, I'll come back to the theme of frustration. So I'm basing my work presented today, it's a group effort. The work on the stereotype content model is work done with Amy Cuddy and Peter Glick. And the premise of this work is that when people are learning about another individual person or another group in their society, the first thing you need to know is whether that those others are on your side or not. So it's like the guard who calls out in the night, halt, who goes there, friend or foe. And from that inference, people try to figure out whether the other's intent is, and we call that intent warmth. You'll see in the data that I'm presenting today that we really focus on this concept of intent detection because other human beings, their behavior is predictable by what they intend to do and what their social intentions are. Then the second thing we need to know about another human is, or a group of humans, is whether they're able or unable to act on that intentions. And we call that dimension competence. This is a very simple pair of dimensions. The warmth and competence space turns out to be very intuitive and very useful. I sometimes think about it as we were given a hammer for the holidays and we're hitting everything with it because everything looks like a nail. What I'll be presenting today is based on both survey data and some neural data too. Next slide, please. So I'm assuming that you're on the slide beyond the stereotype content slide. Okay, so you should be on the slide now that says stereotype content model at the top of it. And it has a grid with a 2x2 on it. So this is a schematic way to look at our data. In the low part of the space, all over the world are people who are poor, and in particular people who are homeless or immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants. People report that people without an address, so this includes Bedouins, Roma people, anybody who's sort of a rootless migrant. People report that these folks receive stereotypic impressions of being untrustworthy and incompetent. And the emotion that people report for these low stereotyped groups is disgust, which is, a very negative emotion. It's one that you can direct toward a pile of garbage instead of a person. This is the most dehumanized combination in our model. Next slide. The exact opposite of that is the societal in-group, its allies and reference groups, citizens of a country, the middle class, the default religion in that society, all go in this high part of the space. And these are the stereotypes that people are reporting to us about these kinds of groups. People report that these groups elicit pride and admiration, so that's a pretty good place to be. These we're great and they're terrible type of stereotypes. You could get this from the standard intergroup relations literature, but what our model adds, if you look at the next slide, are the ambivalent parts of the space. So groups that are seen as well-intentioned but incompetent include all over the world older people and people with disabilities, and these groups receive pity. which is an ambivalent emotion. It says, I feel sorry for you, but only as long as you're subordinate to me. I should say that in each of the cells of each of the quadrants of our space, there are different ethnic groups that fit in different countries, and I'll come to that in a moment. But the ones I'm putting up here are the ones that are true pretty much everywhere. The final quadrant is most relevant for the conference today. If you look at the next slide, so all 4 of the quadrants should be filled in now. Groups that are seen as wealthy or professionals are seen as highly competent but cold, that is, not trustworthy. And there are many ethnic groups that have traditionally fit into this. Most of them are outsider entrepreneurs. Over time, Jewish people have often been in this quadrant. Asians now, particularly Chinese for countries in the West. And the reason that this is an ambivalent case is because of the high competence and the high status and the achievements of these groups, but they're seen as foreign and not us. And envy is directed toward them. Envy is a very ambivalent, volatile emotion because it says, you have something I want and I'd like to take it away from you. And historically, many genocides have been directed toward groups that fall into the envy quadrant. So what I intend to do is to give you a little general background on this model and our evidence for it, and then to go to each of these quadrants and talk about our neural data that are relevant to this. Next slide. So this is an example of a cluster analysis result from an American data set. If you look in the top right corner, you see middle-class people, Christians, white people, blue-collar people, men and women. So these are groups that are seen as trustworthy and competent. If you look in the lower left, you see 2 groups. The far left, you see poor people, as I mentioned, and teenagers who have gone over. As a parent, I can tell you, they've gone over to the dark side, as compared to children who are innocent and well-intentioned. And then you can see in the top left corner, you have older people and Latinos and are on the edge of that. But if you look down right below it, there's a cluster of blacks, conservatives, atheists, and Muslims. Most relevant to the conversation today, Muslims are regarded in all the Western samples that we have as being untrustworthy. Their competence is seen as moderate, and we have data suggesting that they are viewed as having different subtypes, some of which are more competent than others. These are all stereotypes, I want to say. In the lower right, you see rich people and Asians and Jewish people on the boundary of that. So this just illustrates the kind of data that we have when we do surveys. These are people's reports of how society views these groups. And if you go to the next slide, these are the emotions that are reported as being most true for each of these groups. And so when I talk about the pity quadrant or the envy quadrant, that's what I mean. Okay, next slide. By this time, we have data from around the world, and everywhere that we go, we find that these dimensions differentiate the groups in that society and form a kind of cultural map of intergroup relations, which is useful. So it seems to be generalizable, this model, across nations. And if you look at the next slide, also over time. So Federica Durante did a content analysis of Italian fascist magazines, and they were obsessed with social groups. And this content analysis spontaneously yielded our 2 dimensions. So you can see that Italians and Aryans were viewed by the fascists as the ideal high warmth, high competence groups. Black people and mixed race people were seen as low on both dimensions. And Jewish people and English people were seen as threatening, that is, competent but not trustworthy, and consistent with a fascist setting, there was nobody in the pity quadrant. So our 2x2 space is not a recent invention. It's something that seems to hold up over time and place. Next slide. So I use the term universal guardedly. I realize it's a dangerous term to use as a scientist, but at this point we have data across different kinds of American samples. We have data from all the different countries that I showed you a moment ago, data over time, data over levels, that is subtypes of men and women, gay men and lesbians, African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, and Muslims. So this warmth and competence pair of concepts seem to apply across time and place and levels. And even, so if you think about the basic principle of detecting intent, humans are not the only ones who have intentions. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that people apply it even to animals. So who's like us, our dogs and cats and horses and monkeys and elephants are smart. Who's disgusting, those slimy fish and lizards and snakes. The predators are competent but cold. And in the pity quadrant, you have hamsters and rabbits and cows and ducks. Many of these animals are animals that we eat, which is interesting. But my point is simply that it's widely applicable. Next slide. So I mentioned the stereotypes and the emotions. In addition, these combinations in the orange boxes, you can see the behaviors that are directed toward different kinds of groups. So the top half of the space, the trustworthy, warm half of the space, elicits helping and protecting in an active way. The bottom half elicits active attacking and fighting. And on the right, groups get a passive cooperation and association. On the left, passive exclusion and demeaning. So what this means is that in the high part of the space, for example, Christians in the United States, they get active helping and active and passive cooperation. In the low part of the space, for example, homeless people who are, you can see way down in the bottom corner, they're 3 standard deviations out from everybody else, which means they're in a different population in effect. Homeless people get treated with both exclusion and demeaning, that is, people don't pay attention to them ordinarily, but occasionally people will actively attack them and fight with them. But the two ambivalent parts of the space, so people with disabilities and older people get active helping and protecting, as when we institutionalize them to make sure that they're physically okay, but they're socially excluded and demeaned. And then the envy quadrant, which is most relevant here today, people will cooperate and associate with groups in the envy quadrant. They will shop at their stores and do business with them. But then when the society has some breakdown, there will be active attacking and fighting, and their stores will be looted, and in the worst case, genocide. So what I'm talking about here are shared cultural stereotypes and emotional prejudices and behaviors that get directed toward these groups. Next slide. One point I want to make is that what predicts the behavior is the black part of these bars, which is the emotions, and the stereotypes themselves are the gray parts of the bars. So you get the best predictor of behavior are emotions. And if you look at the next slide, we're not the only ones who find that. So the overall theory and the data that we have say that the social structure, that is, the perceived competitiveness and status of the groups, cause people to detect intent, which we'll come back to in terms of the medial prefrontal cortex. These images of warmth and competence in turn predict differentiated emotions, which in turn predict behavior. The proximal cause of behavior are the emotions. So if somebody says this group disgusts me, you know what kinds of behavior will be directed toward them. And I'll make a case for that. In talking about the neural data, I'm going to be focusing in on the medial prefrontal cortex, which is reliably activated when people think about other people. As a social psychologist, I'm rather fond of this part of the brain because it seems to care about sociality, in particular, detecting other people's intentions and internal states. Okay, next slide. What I'm going to focus on first is status distinctions, because these are one of the big divides that we've found to be amenable to a neural analysis. So next slide. One of the things that we have found is that if you look at status, this is work done with Malia Mason and Joe McGee. If you look at status and define it as the ability to act on your goals because you have resources, and you take the MPFC as an indicator of people thinking hard about other people in social cognition and attributing intent, what Mason and McGee and I did was show people photographs like the one of the two men there and say which one of these people has higher status than the other, or which one of them weighs more than the other. And we had a whole series of photographs. And what you find is that when people are attributing status to two people, the medial prefrontal cortex comes online. But when you're attributing relative weight to two people, it does not. So that's simply some evidence consistent with the idea that the MPFC cares about social relationships and in particular what goes on in people's minds socially. Next slide. So we also had earlier looked at this idea of status, and we did a study using the trolley dilemma, which I will describe to you. So in the trolley dilemma, which is depicted on the right, Joe is standing on an overpass next to another person. There's a streetcar that's running down the track that's out of control. If the streetcar gets all the way down to the 5 people who are on the trolley track, they will be killed. But Joe has the option of pushing the person next to him off of the overpass, which will stop the trolley. It will kill that person, but it will save the 5. And so the trolley dilemma is, you tell participants that Joe has pushed this guy off the overpass, and they're asked if this is acceptable or not. So most people say it's not acceptable to do this. But the student who's pictured, Rachel Farnsworth, had the brilliant idea to put different kinds of people on the trolley track and see whether different people are valued differently. So we put all combinations of people from the stereotype content model onto the trolley track or onto the overpass to see whether there were variations in acceptability ratings. And then we also looked at the choice networks to see what kinds of thinking people were doing. If you look at the next slide, the baseline result, if you don't tell people what kind of people are on the track and the overpass, 80 to 90% of participants say it's not okay for Joe to push the person off the overpass. But when you put different kinds of groups on the track and on the overpass, 69% of our participants said it was okay to sacrifice a member of a low competent group. That is, for example, an older person or a homeless person. It would be okay to sacrifice that person to save 5 people. There was also a main effect for who you're saving. If they're high competence groups on the trolley track, 5 people who are either, say, middle class or rich people, then it's okay to sacrifice a single person to save them. But the crucial finding here is the interaction. So 84% of the participants said it's okay to sacrifice one poor person to save 5 in-group people. And this differs significantly from all the other trade-offs. So basically, you can reverse the baseline finding that it's not okay to do this by the status of the people that you put on the track and on the overpass. So this is commodifying the people that you're saving and you're sacrificing. And I think this is one form of dehumanization on the basis of status. We did brain scans primarily to see what kind of decision-making people were engaged in, whether it was kind of a knee-jerk automatic one or a thoughtful one. And if you look at the next slide, what I want you to focus in on primarily is the MPFC. This, and then the other ones you could characterize as a social decision, difficult decision network. This network was most active when people were overriding what would normally be an unacceptable choice. So the same comparisons that I was showing you on the previous slides are activated, activate the MPFC. So this suggests that people are thinking hard about the people that they're sacrificing and saving, but mainly consistent with the Mason et al. Study, they could be just simply making a status calculation. So this is something like what insurance companies do. Insurance companies, when somebody dies, they pay the family what the person's remaining income would have been. Okay, so this is just the status dimension. If we look at the next slide, this is just to remind you that we focused on status, but in particular, if you hit the advance button, it should show you that the biggest contrast was between the high part of the space and the low part of the space. Okay, next slide. Why is this not going? What I want is that the slide should have poor people, homeless people, and immigrants highlighted. And are we up to that slide? So what I'm going to do is talk about the different quadrants and work that we've done looking at, in effect, the goal is to look for a neural signature of responses to people in these different parts of the space. Because if this warmth by competence framework is pretty relentless and maybe universal, then there ought to be neural signatures of responses to groups in these different parts of the space because they've been around for a long time in other forms. So the first work we did on this was looking at the low part of the space, the disgust quadrant. If you look at the next slide, this is work that Lasana Harris has done. Many of you may be familiar with it. Again, it starts from the idea that the MPFC normally reliably activates when people are thinking about other people, attributing intent. But our thought was that this might not be true for the most extreme out groups, the homeless people, and in this study also drug addicts. And what we did was show people photographs of people from different parts of the stereotype content space. And in the main study, we asked people about their emotional reactions to these slides they were seeing. And what you see in the lower left is an absence of activation, significant activation in the MPFC when people are looking at pictures of a homeless person. So when people are thinking about old people, the MPFC comes on. When people are thinking about the envy quadrant, the MPFC comes on. And certainly when they're thinking about the middle class and their own citizens, the MPFC comes on. But it fails to come on when people are looking at homeless people and drug addicts. And presumably you would get the same effect for undocumented immigrants and other groups that are in the low part of the space. So this finding sparked Lasana's research program that went on from there. And, we found self-report data also indicating that people find it hard to get inside the heads of these folks. So this is really the most extreme form of dehumanization that we see in our data. The next slide, we made some effort to look at reactions to groups in the pity part of the space. If you look at the next slide, this is unpublished data for a reason, which is that we were not very satisfied with the results. But I can tell you that in the pity quadrant, this is the high warmth, low competence quadrant. We found activation in the MPFC when people were trying to figure out how this happened to the person. So we found that people would pity people in this quadrant if these people had not brought the accident on themselves and were trying to make it better by going to physical therapy and doing the things they were supposed to do. So they were showing good intentions about their bad situation. But this whole process of whether they're at fault for the cause of their disability or their misfortune and whether they're doing something to make it better activates some areas of the MPFC. Okay, next slide. Another approach that we took to this part of the space was to look at women who are sexualized and thought of in very sexist traditional roles. So the premise in this work that Mina Cikara was the leader on, the premise in this work is that for heterosexual men who are hostile sexists, gender roles are prescriptive. That is, women are supposed to behave in certain ways and not others. And that in particular, sexualized women would be seen as having bodies but not minds. So we predicted that people would recognize the bodies of sexualized women but not their faces. They would not be individuated. And that the MPFC would not be activated, particularly when women are being seen as kind of objects. So if you look at the next slide, what you see is that we showed people pictures of men and women clothed and less clothed. And we then showed them, after showing them a whole bunch of these pictures, we did a recognition test of just the body from the neck down or the face. And what you see is that people, the men, these were male subjects, the male subjects recognized unclothed bodies, but particularly unclothed female bodies, but they were not recognizing their faces. If you look at the next slide, what you see is that hostile sexism correlates within the MPFC in a negative way for women. So the chart that I'm showing you is the correlation of hostile sexism with deactivation in the MPFC for the bikini-clad women. Doesn't appear from the men, it's the opposite. So this is a kind of dehumanization in the same way as for the homeless people, which is the people, hostile, sexist men, are deactivating their MPFC the more sexist they are, but for the bikini-clad women. So this is another clue that the MPFC is important in humanizing another person. Next slide. All right. The next to last quadrant I want to talk about is the envy quadrant. And I think that this is the most relevant to this conference because this is the quadrant that's most threatening to people and most frustrating. And as I mentioned as an aside earlier, groups that are seen as well off but not trusted are the ones who are the objects of envy, which is the volatile emotion that often can, under certain circumstances, lead to intergroup violence. Next slide. So Mina Cikara's work on Schadenfreude may be relevant to some of you, may be familiar to some of you. Envied out groups are, as a reminder, seen as competent but cold. This guy with his yacht is looking pretty self-satisfied. But if you look how close he's standing to the edge of the dock, if he were to step backwards, he would fall in the water. And, we wouldn't mind that too much. Usually when I'm in person, I can see that audiences are smiling when I say that. That's Schadenfreude. So people feel good about their bad events, and if he were to get wet, we would not be sorry. In fact, we'd feel a little good about it. If he were to buy another yacht, we would not be particularly happy. So the chart that you see in the lower left shows that for the different quadrants of the stereotype content space, if you take a different score between feeling good about their bad events and feeling bad about their good events, what you see is that for 3 of the groups, people generally feel good when something good happens to them, but for the envy quadrant, they feel good when something bad happens to them. So this is consistent with the idea that the envy quadrant is uniquely subject to Schadenfreude. And then Mina had the bright idea to use EMG recordings on people's faces to capture the malicious glee that people feel when the envy quadrant has something bad happen to them. So this is the kind of thing I mean when I say that this is a volatile emotion and a dangerous one. So people smile. The EMG recordings were from the zygomaticus major, which is the smile muscle. So this is one clue to this. And then Mina's research program took her in the next slide to looking at harm. In this case, the ethical and feasible way to study this in the lab was to take rival sports teams, really extreme fans of 2 rival teams, in this case, the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. And when you ask people who are fans of each of these baseball teams, people report mutual envy. So, for example, the Red Sox fans envy the New York Yankees because they see them as wealthy and being able to buy any player they want. So that's very similar to the intergroup envy that I was talking about. What people showed, among other things, was pleasure at when their own team won. So we showed them plays that are depicted electronically in the top right. They showed pleasure when their team won, not surprising. They showed pleasure when their team lost, the other team lost to them. But what we think of as being pure Schadenfreude is when the rival team loses to a third party. And that's what's depicted in the brain scan for the ventral striatum. So the really provocative part of these data is that these fans were willing to report having harmed their rival fans, not in a huge, violent way, but throwing food at them, shouting at them, sometimes pushing and shoving them. And the neural traces correlated with not only pleasure, as I've mentioned, but also with reports of having harmed a rival team. So this is some evidence that Schadenfreude, or at least malicious glee at somebody else's misfortune, correlates with pleasure and actually self-reported harm. So you can think of this as a kind of simulation of larger, more significant intergroup violence. Next slide. Okay. Well, I don't want to end on a negative note, so what I'd like to do is talk about solutions to this kind of thing. So if we focus on what happens in the in-group, reference group quadrant, next slide. What Dan Ames and I did was look at what you might view as an antidote to frustration, and that is interdependence. And we found evidence of people rehumanizing other people. So the baseline situation is that all these stereotypes that I've been describing to you, when people are not dependent on other people, when their outcomes are independent, what you see is more MPFC activation to expected stereotypical information than to unexpected information. So it's as if people are looking at a group that they stereotype and saying, yes, I expected that, I expected that, I expected that. So it perpetuates the stereotypes because people are tending to and focusing on expected information over unexpected information. And we've seen this in our previous data with attention and what people talk about when they talk about the groups as they're making sense of them. And these data indicate that you have MPFC activation to expected information over unexpected information. So normally these stereotypes are self-perpetuating, but if you make people interdependent, that is, if you tell people that you are going to be working with this person and your outcomes depend on the other person and you're on a team together, then, next slide, the effect reverses. When people are outcome dependent, they pay attention specifically and the MPFC activates to unexpected information more than expected information. So to rehumanize another person, what you need to be doing is working together with the person for a goal that matters to you. And this is our neural contribution to a literature that goes back 50 years. So next slide. I'm done. It takes a village to do research, and this is some members of our current village.